59 Buckingham Gate, London. Rows and rows of wooden chairs are packed as heads crane for a view of the witness who stands next to an enormous half model of an ocean liner. The model itself is about the size of a small rowboat. The witness's voice echoes through the galleries and the towering space called the London Scottish Drill Hall for the regiment it headquartered. A panel of serious-looking men watch the witness intently from behind their solid wooden desks. "Do you still think," asks one of them, "that it was natural not to think about going back and saving some of those people?" The witness thinks for a moment before he responds carefully. "I think it was still natural, but I concede that it would have been a very splendid thing if it could have been done." The witness is talking about why his lifeboat, barely full, did not return to help the hundreds of people crying out after their ship had slipped beneath the waves. It's Monday, May 30, 1912, day 11 of a 36-day inquiry into the loss of Titanic, which now rests nearly 4 kilometers deep on the bottom of the ocean. Just how it got there, the complicated series of events that led to the sinking and the persons or parties at fault, is at the core of this investigation. Just after Titanic survivors had landed at New York, an American inquiry was hastily called that to many in Britain seemed little more than political theatre. Now, the government and the public hoped to find out the real truth. What had happened that night Titanic sank? What changes had to be made to ensure it never happened again? Unfortunately, for all of its solid material findings and recommendations, the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry into the loss of Titanic would prove to be its own political theatre too, a kind of whitewash which diverted attention away from the dark truth of how and why the newest and greatest ship on Earth had sunk. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the story of the British Titanic Wreck Inquiry. News of the loss of Titanic, as well as the nearly 1,500 men, women and children that succumbed in its sinking, was initially slow to spread. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, headlines were a tangled, ugly mess of misinformation, causing mass confusion among a public that was desperate for answers. Some news reports claimed the ship had been involved in a minor collision and was making for Halifax, with all souls accounted for. But later that same day, the grim truth was revealed. Titanic was lost, marking the most staggering maritime tragedy the world had yet seen. In Southampton, there was massive grief. Most of the crew had come from there. And across the world, telegraphs chattered with fantastical tales of panic in the final moments, men dressing as women to escape, the captain sacrificing himself to rescue a baby. Just what exactly had happened out there on the cold Atlantic was shrouded in mystery. And even as the ship's victims were still bobbing in their life jackets on the ocean's surface, moves were being made to hastily convene an inquiry in the US. The Americans were quick to jump at the opportunity because Carpathia had landed the entire load of survivors at New York in one go. Officials only had a tiny window to subpoena witnesses who could explain how so many people, many of them Americans, had died. Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan oversaw the inquiry, having accosted White Star Chairman Bruce Ismay to ensure his cooperation with the investigation before Ismay had even had a chance to step foot from off the Carpathia when she'd arrived. His authority came with backing from the White House. President Taft had lost a close friend and confidant in the Titanic sinking, Major Archibald Butt, and the disaster had devastated him. With the witnesses hastily gathered and proceedings underway, the whole thing was marred with controversy. Seeking out answers in the wake of the disaster was all well and good, but tension between Titanic's surviving crew and Smith, himself no seaman, boiled over into outright, open hostility. The crew, many of whom had lost virtually all that they possessed, were now kept as prisoners in New York until the inquiry was finished. Officers like Lightoller were presented with questions, many of them seemingly nonsensical, that rankled them. They gave half-hearted answers or ignored questions outright, deeply resentful that the crew of a British ship were being investigated by an American inquiry that seemed little more than the political theatre Smith needed to curry favour with his president. By the end, the investigation concluded the ship's loss was the consequence of Captain Smith's flippant attitude towards the ice warnings he had received, and the tragic loss of life was primarily the fault of inadequate emergency drills, as well as having too few lifeboats and a lack of organised emergency response. But almost at the same time the Americans launched their investigation into the disaster, the British began laying the groundwork for proceedings of their own. Titanic being a British-flagged vessel, it was only logical that the British Board of Trade investigate the sinking of their ship. The Board of Trade was a government body that oversaw commerce, trade and industry, everything from farming to merchant shipping. It was a vast scope of authority headed by Sidney Buxton. As far as shipping was concerned, it had been responsible for outlining all the regulations British ships had to follow in order to operate legally. To help with this, it had advisors who provided insight into how shipping companies actually worked, many of the advisors being managers and directors from the big shipping lines themselves. Buxton called for the inquiry himself and asked the Lord Chancellor to appoint a Wreck Commissioner to oversee the events, and the man chosen for the job was a certain John Bigham, the Lord Mersey. Mersey was an interesting character, a lawyer and a QC who tried his hand at politics, unsuccessfully, before presiding over a handful of obscure but important bodies. He was the son of a wealthy merchant from Liverpool. Crucially, early in his career, he'd worked in merchant shipping cases and naturally developed an interest in the subject. Mersey's appointment wasn't without controversy and already cast a small shadow of doubt over the authenticity of the upcoming inquiry. He'd been a guest at the Shipwrights Company, a professional shipbuilders club whose members included White Star Line's own Bruce Ismay and some of the senior leadership from the yard that actually built Titanic, including Lord William Peary. He had frequent dealings with the big shipping lines and felt strongly about Britain's dominance at sea. At a dinner for the Chamber of Shipping in February 1908, he had proposed a toast saying that those connected with the industry had to see that nothing was done by legislation or in other ways which would decrease the carrying power of this great country. This judge, who had regularly sided with the big shipping lines over pay disputes and strikes, was the man adopted as the head of the so-called Independent Tribunal. Britain's Prime Minister Asquith declared that the Board of Trade had absolutely no power to direct the course of the inquiry, but it's difficult to swallow the idea that Mersey was an independent and neutral leader in the proceedings. At the House of Commons, the Prime Minister was challenged by Irish politician Edward Carson. Does the right honourable gentleman imagine Lord Mersey will be influenced by the Board of Trade? He had asked. It was a fair thing to ask, but inevitably it called the man's honour into question. No, sir, said the Prime Minister. It's an insult to Lord Mersey to suggest it. So it was that the inquiry would be headed by a man who had Britain's shipping interests very, very much at heart, advised by a team of officials who, unlike their American counterparts, came equipped with actual maritime experience and knowledge. There was the Chair of Naval Architecture at the University of Glasgow, an Admiral from the Royal Navy, a Senior Engineer Assessor, a Senior Captain and Representative of the Trinity House Organisation, and another assessor, a commander of the Royal Navy Reserve. It was hoped that they'd avoid the embarrassing pitfalls experienced by US Senator Smith as he fumbled his way through awkward lines of questioning during the Senate inquiry. Second Officer Lightoller later wrote that the American hearings were, quote, such a contrast to the dignity and decorum of the court held by Lord Mersey in London, where the guiding spirit was a sailor, in essence, and who insisted that any cross-questioner should at any rate be familiar with at least the rudiments of the sea. With the Board of Trade having called for the inquiry and appointed the Wreck Commissioner, this meant they were essentially investigating themselves and their own interests. Compared to the American investigation, which took place over the course of 18 days, the British inquiry amounted to a whopping 36. Whether that's a testament to the thoroughness of the investigation or the consequences of long-winded and meandering questioning is a debate for another day. But the hearings began on May 2nd, 1912 at the London Scottish Drill Hall, a venue chosen specifically for its size. Unfortunately, every word uttered in the cavernous room echoed and reverberated to the point where many in attendance complained that much of what was being said was completely inaudible. Despite even Lord Mersey himself in agreement that the venue was unsatisfactory for their purposes, the hearings wouldn't be moved to a new location until their second-to-last day. Sir Rufus Isaacs, the Attorney General for England and Wales, started off the hearings by presenting a comprehensive list of 26 questions that the inquiry wanted to answer. They covered everything from Titanic's installed safety equipment, like the lifeboats and their testing, to the ship's wireless communication capabilities, her overall design and accessibility, and of course, the protocols surrounding the evacuation on the night of the sinking. The hope was that by answering these questions, the court could paint a clearer picture of the ill-fated maiden voyage and better understand the reasons behind the loss of the ship. They accepted the questions, and with the last formalities in place, the investigation could officially get underway. The first day of testimony saw two rather unexpected men called to give their version of events: lookout Archie Jewell, who hadn't even been on watch when Titanic hit the iceberg, and sailor Joseph Scarrett. In fact, those first few days focused mainly on Titanic's lower decks, with fireman George Beauchamp and Frederick Barrett called on day 3. Clearly, Mersey and the panel wanted to establish a clear understanding of exactly what had happened to Titanic when it hit the berg. When the court adjourned for the weekend, Lord Mersey and the others toured Olympic, Titanic's near-identical sister ship, to better understand the layout, the safety equipment, and the construction. In their mind's eye, it placed them right there on the night of Titanic's sinking. Of particular interest was the Marconi wireless set. The operator even called up Cape Ushant station in France for a demo. Back at the Scottish Drill Hall, and leading stoker Barrett painted a compelling picture. Down in the dimly lit boiler rooms, the red light on the stoking indicator flashing red in the middle of his watch. Before the furnace dampers could even be shut, came the grinding impact and the rush of water, 2 feet above the deck plates. Even this formal inquiry wasn't without its moments of levity, though. Where did the water come from? Asked the Solicitor General, John Simon, who represented the Board of Trade. Well, came Barrett's reply, out of the sea, I expect. So concerned was the Board of Inquiry with the impact that the first week was almost entirely devoted to what had happened down below the waterline, having witnesses specify where they saw water entering the ship and cross-referencing with the enormous half-model of Titanic installed at the hull for demonstration purposes. But who the board really wanted to speak with were the ship's officers, but by the end of the first week, they were still on a ship on their way over to Britain. On the third full day of the hearings, Quartermaster Hitchens was called to testify. As the man quite literally behind the wheel at the moment Titanic collided with the iceberg, his testimony was deeply important. But the line of questioning taken with Hitchens highlighted one of the British Inquiry's huge flaws. Like many ships of the day, Titanic's wheelhouse was completely closed off and darkened by blinds at night time. The quartermaster, the man at the ship's wheel, simply responded only to verbal commands from the officers of the watch outside. It meant that Hitchens had a unique perspective of the disaster in that, despite being at the helm at the time of the collision, he couldn't see anything of the outside world. He indicated as much early on in his testimony, when he was asked by Lord Mersey, was the speed altered before the collision? To which Hitchens said, well, the crash came immediately. I know it did. Had the speed been altered before? Mersey continued. No, I could not say, my lord, because I could not see the officer on the bridge. I am in the wheelhouse. I cannot see anything, only my compass. But despite this, he continued to be pressed on this point when he was questioned by Attorney General Sir Rufus Isaacs, who asked Hitchens, while you were remaining at the wheel until 12:23, could you see what was going on board the vessel? Hitchens, I could not see anything. Later in the same questioning, Isaacs again pressed the issue, could you see the watertight doors being closed? Hitchens, I could not see anything but my compass. Isaacs again, where you were not able to see it? Hitchens, no. And again, when questioned by Sir Robert Finlay, representing the White Star Line, could you see ahead at all through the wheelhouse? I could not see anything. You would not be able to see the iceberg, even if it had been quite clear, is that what you mean? No, I could not see it. On no account whatever could I see it. This type of repetitive questioning seemed to plague the entire inquiry, with witnesses asked to recount the same information over and over to one official after another. It resulted in a kind of endless bureaucratic line of interrogation that saw inane questions asked again and again that seemed to dance around the point rather than striking right to the heart of it. Mersey and the others might have argued they were just being thorough, but you still wonder why, on day 21, after White Star Line's chief marine superintendent had explained thoroughly that 18 of his 30 years as an officer and captain had been with that company, Mersey asked if he had ever been to sea. Day 7 of the hearings brought some salacious drama. It saw Captain Stanley Lord, the skipper of the steamer Californian, take to the stand. During the American hearings, it had come to light that on the night of the sinking, the Californian had been within sight of the Titanic as she went under but had neglected to come to her aid, claiming that despite seeing distress rockets fired from a nearby ship, they simply didn't know what it meant. The Wreck Commissioner and his council were now aiming to understand exactly what had happened that night on board Californian that prevented the crew from making for the foundering steamer that was by all accounts sinking from right under their noses. Unfortunately, the picture painted by Lord in his testimony only seemed to shirk responsibility and arguably only managed to make the already perplexing situation even murkier. The Attorney General asked, "And did you say to the third officer, the only passenger steamer near us is the Titanic?" "I might have said that," said Lord, "with regard to the steamer, but I did not say that the steamer was a passenger steamer." Mersey cuts in here. He says, "You do not give answers that please me at present. You just said now, as plainly as possible, that you answered the third officer, I think it was, and said, the only passenger steamer near us is the Titanic, but you now suggest that you do not remember whether you said it or not?" Captain Lord lamely responded with, "I do not recollect saying anything to him about it, my lord." While the captain admitted to being in the vicinity of Titanic and spotting a ship in the distance sending up rockets, he still denied that this ship could have been the sinking Titanic. The Attorney General asked, "We know from the evidence in this case that the Titanic did send up rockets for some considerable time." Lord says yes. "So as far as I understand from you, you do not know of any other steamer which on that night and about this time sent up rockets?" "I do not." "Does not it strike you now that the steamer you saw sending up rockets must have been the Titanic?" "No." It was all to do with Titanic's reported position. During the sinking, 4th Officer Joseph Boxall had taken a celestial reading that the wireless men broadcast as the ship's sinking position. In the event, Boxall was wrong and put Titanic sinking about 10 miles further west of her actual spot. Despite Lord's testimony and the stated position of his ship during the sinking, Mersey simply determined he was wrong and Boxall was right. This put Californian much closer to the reported Titanic sinking position, and it damned Lord and his men for their inaction. But striking right at the heart of the matter, Mr. C. Robertson Dunlop, representing the Leyland Line, owners of the Californian, questioned Lord on his ship's ability to render aid any sooner than the Carpathia. Assuming, he asked, that she sank somewhere between 2 and 3, could you, in fact, if you had known at 1:15 in the morning that the Titanic was in distress to the southward and westward of you, have reached her before, say, 3 a.m? Lord said no, most certainly not. Could you have navigated with any degree of safety to your vessel at night through the ice that you, in fact, encountered? It would have been most dangerous, Lord responded. Would the attempt, from what you know now, in fact have succeeded? I do not think, Lord said, we would have got there before the Carpathia did, if we would have got there as soon. It was in Lord's best interest to defend himself and his ship from blame, so it's no surprise that he plays up the danger here. But he's not wrong. Unlike Carpathia, Californian had been stopped for the night because of the ice, and she already found herself surrounded by bergs. The ship would have had to have crawled its way ahead, groping through the darkness lest she fall prey to an iceberg as well. That point was lost on Mersey, and while Lord wasn't prosecuted for his crew's supposed inaction, the disaster was a black stain on the 34-year-old's career that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Meanwhile, where the American Inquiry had questioned some 21 surviving passengers of the disaster, the British hearings heard the testimonies of just 2, aside from White Star Chief Bruce Ismay, and those were first-class passengers Sir Cosmo and Lady Lucille Duff Gordon, questioned on day 11. The couple had famously escaped in Lifeboat No. 1, one of the ship's small emergency cutters, which was lowered away with just 12 people aboard, despite having capacity for 40. With survivors in the water fighting for their very lives after Titanic had disappeared, those aboard Lifeboat 1 ignored their cries, supposedly because the passengers aboard were terrified of being swamped. Rumours began to spread in the wake of the disaster that the inaction was also thanks to a bribe of £5, around £730 today, almost $1,000 offered by Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon to the sailors manning the lifeboat on the condition that they declined to return to try to rescue anybody. At the inquiry, he faced the Attorney General, who asked, "I must ask you about the money. Had you made any promise of a present to the men in the boat?" Duff Gordon said, "Yes, I did." "Will you tell us about that?" Duff Gordon explained, "There was a man sitting next to me, and of course in the dark I could see nothing of him. I never did see him, and I do not yet know who he is. He said to me, 'I suppose you have lost everything,' and I said, 'Of course.' He says, 'But you can get some more,' and I said, 'Yes.' 'Well,' he said, We've lost all our kit, and the company won't give us any more. And what's more, our pay stops from tonight. All they will do is send us back to London. So I said to them, you fellows need not worry about that. I'll give you a £5 each to start a new kit. That, he said, is the whole of that £5 note story. Clement Edwards, representing the Dock Labourers Union, examined Sir Duff Gordon and attempted to understand why exactly those aboard Lifeboat 1 declined to aid survivors in the water, but failed to come up with a satisfactory answer. Do you think, he asked, it was natural then not to think of rescuing those people who were drowning? It's a difficult question to answer, Duff Gordon said, if you put it like that. At the time, I saw no possibility. I thought there was no possibility of doing so. Edwards pressed him. I will put it this way. Do you still think that it was natural not to think about going back and saving some of those people? I think it was still natural, Duff Gordon said, but I concede that it would have been a very splendid thing if it could have been done. The uncomfortable truth was that more first-class men had survived than third-class children. The Duff Gordons' reputation never recovered, and the questions about the supposed bribery loomed large. It was a mystery the inquiry never quite got to the bottom of. But just why a civilian passenger was being grilled about why his boat did not return is, in itself, a bit of a mystery too, considering Duff Gordon was not an employee of the shipping line or actually in charge of the lifeboat. The whole thing smacked of theatre. With the inquiry now stretching into its second week, the first of the ship's surviving officers had arrived. He was the most senior, Charles Lightoller, the second officer, and he was finally called to testify. What resulted was a brutal barrage spanning around 2,000 questions over the course of 2 days, with Lightoller's testimony filling the entirety of day 12 by itself. Later, Lightoller would write of the experience, I know when it was all over, I felt more like a legal doormat than a mailboat officer, and I don't blame him one bit. Lightoller was questioned on every move he made throughout the night of the sinking, from his brief conversation with Captain Smith on the bridge regarding visibility prior to the collision, to the loading and lowering of the lifeboats, to his rescue on Carpathia after braving the elements, balanced on top of an overturned collapsible throughout the entire night. Most interesting of all was Lightoller's adamant claim the Titanic could not possibly have split in two, despite what was reported by other survivors. The Solicitor General asked him, I do not know whether you can help us at all in describing what happened to the ship. You were engaged and had other things to think about, but what did happen to the ship? Can you tell us at all? Lightoller knew what he was getting at. Are you referring to the reports of the ship breaking in two? Yes, answered the Solicitor General. It is utterly untrue, Lightoller said. The ship did not, and could not, have broken in two. Later, as the 2-day bombardment was coming to a close, Mersey himself offered Lightoller an opportunity to revise his statement, but instead he doubled down. It is suggested, Mersey said, that perhaps you, being in the water, would not see that righting of the aft part of the ship at all, and that you possibly only saw her after she had got in that position and was going down. Lightoller refused to budge. I should not think, after once she had shown a tendency to break and was weakened, she would ever have the strength to right again. Mersey said, you do not give credit to those witnesses who say that the after part of the ship, having once been up in the air, righted itself? No, my lord, he answered. I do not. On the topic of Stanley Lord and his claim that he had mistaken Titanic's distress rockets for company signals, Lightoller was quick to dismiss this as highly improbable. The Solicitor General asked him, if you had seen those signals, like those sent up from another ship, would you have known for certain what they were? I would have seen them and known immediately, Lightoller said. We've heard something about company signals, the Solicitor General pressed. Do they resemble those at all? In no way, to my knowledge, answered Lightoller. The officer was heavily criticised for his actions during the evacuation, having reportedly stuck to a strict women and children only policy rather than women and children first, resulting in many of his lifeboats being lowered away with sometimes half as many passengers as the boats were rated to carry. When questioned by Solicitor General Sir John Simon on why those lifeboats were lowered with so few passengers, Lightoller explained that the fully loaded boats being lowered from the 60-foot height might compromise the integrity of the boats, causing them to buckle. Lightoller explained that he had planned instead to lower the boats partially full, only as far as the gangway doors located down the ship's side where more passengers could be safely loaded in. Here is a boat with only 42 people in it, the Solicitor General asked. And when it's waterborne, everybody agrees it would safely carry more then? Yes, answered Lightoller. Did you give any orders with the object of getting more people into it when it was in the water? Yes, I see what you're alluding to now, Lightoller said. The gangway doors. I'd already sent the boatswain and 6 men and told the boatswain to go down below and take some men with him and open the gangway doors with the intention of sending the boats to the doors to be filled up. So with those considerations in mind, I certainly should not have sent the boats away. The plan was, of course, unsuccessful. The boatswain and his mates were never seen again. Mersey was quick to point out a fundamental flaw in Lightoller's reasoning on the night. It appears to me, he said, that you would be very unlikely to order the forward gangway door to be opened. You might get the head so deep in the water that she might ship water through that gangway door. Of course, my lord, Lightoller said. I did not take that into consideration at the time. There was not time to take all these particulars into mind. In the first place, at this time, I did not think the ship was going down. Now, we have to be fair to Lightoller because he's right. Titanic's sinking was still in question for most of the night, and confronted with a sudden and unexpected evacuation, it would be so easy for the mind to overlook even obvious logic issues. For example, not one of Titanic's officers realised that Captain Smith's original plan to lower the boats to A deck to take passengers on there was impossible, because the ship, unlike Olympic, had big screens with windows that were wound shut, blocking off half the promenade, and it made escape impossible until somebody could find the handle and wind them all down. Because passengers were unable to board any of the boats through the gangway doors, several lifeboats were lowered away without being filled to capacity. Lightoller's copped some criticism over the years for his handling of the evacuation, but the truth is he, like Titanic's other officers, were suddenly presented with the nightmare scenario and very little time to coordinate an effective escape. He was hopelessly underprepared because the system didn't require the crew to coordinate a realistic evacuation drill beforehand. Lightoller had overseen lifeboats being lowered, all 16 of them in fact, at a test in Belfast. But actually lowering empty wooden boats is a very different thing to coordinating an effective evacuation for hundreds and hundreds of people. The passengers had no idea where to go, and the officers had to just do the best with what they had. White Star Line chairman Bruce Ismay was finally free to return to England a month to the day after the Titanic disaster on May 15th, 1912. Just a couple of weeks after, as the British hearings were rounding out their 16th day, having questioned mainly sailors and stewards, Ismay was called as the day's final witness. With his reputation already in tatters publicly, Ismay took to the stand once again, as he had already done during his grilling before the American inquiry. But the battery of questioning was, perhaps unsurprisingly, nowhere near as brutal as what he'd experienced before the US Senate inquiry. Mersey seemed eager to dig into the accusations that would implicate Ismay directly in the disaster, but in doing so, it gave him an opportunity to try to clear his name. One of the major issues first raised was Ismay's supposed role in increasing the ship's speed once it entered the vicinity of ice. Mersey and the other officials questioning him seemed focused on cornering their witness to admit he had directed Captain Smith to speed Titanic towards the ice field, though Ismay himself admitted he had no knowledge of ship navigation. The Attorney General asked, "According to your view, what do you say as to the weather conditions?" "So far as I could judge," Ismay responded, "it was a perfectly fine, clear night." The Attorney General: "So that, on a perfectly fine, clear night, with the expectation that you were coming within the region of ice, your view is that the captain would be justified in increasing his speed?" Ismay answered, "I do not see any reason why he should not, so long as he could see sufficiently far to clear the ice." While it seems as though Ismay was appearing negligent here, his viewpoint was a surprisingly common one, shared by many involved in navigation at the time, most notably Captain Smith himself. See, the idea of maintaining or even increasing your speed in the region of ice was apparently considered the done thing by many White Star Line captains who often prided themselves on their ability to keep their ships on schedule, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Later in the inquiry, Captain Ranson, master of the White Star Liner Baltic, was questioned on this same point by Sir Robert Finlay, representing the White Star Line, and his answers, also unsurprisingly, aligned with his boss's opinion. Sir Robert Finlay asked, "With regard to your speed, you know the practice in the Atlantic. If the weather were clear and ice reported, do you keep up your speed?" Ranson said, "We keep up our speed." "Finlay, is that your invariable practice?" Ranson, "It has always been my practice." But on the other side of this argument was Sir Ernest Shackleton, the legendary explorer famous for his expeditions to the Antarctic. An important distinction is that unlike the other captains mentioned, Shackleton had never been the master of an ocean liner before, and he had little concern for things like weekly schedules and speed. To him, reaching his destination safely was preferable to reaching it quickly, and to this end, he was very well versed on navigating the threat of ice. As a man with expertise in the matter, he was called upon during the final days of the inquiry to present his ideas on how a ship, like Titanic, might have been better handled when faced with the threat of icebergs. The Attorney General asked, "We've been told that none of these lighters slow down, even though they know they're about to go through an ice region, that is to say a region where there are icebergs." Shackleton said, "I've been in a ship which was specially built for ice, but I took the precaution to slow down because you can only tell the condition of any ice you see. There may be projecting spurs and you may suddenly come across them." The Attorney General asked, "So what was the speed of the boat you were in?" Shackleton says she was only 6 knots at full speed. She was 40 years old. The Attorney General said, "Do you mean to say that you slowed down a vessel of 6 knots? Shackleton answered, "Yes, I always did." We know now that the practice of proceeding through an ice field at full speed is dangerous at best and catastrophic at worst, but apparently this didn't seem so obvious to skippers back then. Instead, ocean liner captains maintained a focus on reaching the other side of the Atlantic swiftly, which kept their passengers happy, and booking their ships for future crossings. Most importantly of all, it kept their bosses happy, even if it meant every soul on board would potentially be put in harm's way to do it. Another point which helped to doom Ismay's reputation was that while on board Titanic, he was handed a Marconigram by Captain Smith, which contained the now infamous ice warning from the nearby White Star liner Baltic. Now, with this warning in hand, Ismay was accused of sharing the information contained with a fellow passenger, Mrs. Emily Ryerson, and allegedly explaining to her that he had directed the captain to speed the ship up through the ice field in an effort to reach New York a day early. This, of course, was vehemently denied by Ismay in America, and then again here in the British Inquiry. The Attorney General asked, "Do you know a Mrs. Ryerson of Philadelphia?" Ismay said, "Yes, I met her on board the ship." "And she," the Attorney General went on, "was one of the 2 lady passengers to whom you mentioned the Marconigram in the afternoon?" "That is true." "You showed her the wireless message, did you not?" "I read it to her, I think." "Now, I want to put it to you like this. Did she say to you, 'Of course, you will slow down,' and did you reply, 'Oh no, we will put on more boilers to get out of it'?" Ismay, "Certainly not." We may never know for sure what information was actually exchanged during the course of this conversation between Ismay and Ryerson, but in a letter dated April 18th, 1913, just over a year after the sinking, Ryerson wrote insisting that Ismay had in fact alluded to the ship increasing speed and arriving in New York early, despite his claims to the contrary. She wrote, "I was on deck in the afternoon of April 14 between 5 or 6 o'clock, and Mr. Ismay came up and inquired if our staterooms were comfortable and the service satisfactory, etc., and then thrust a Marconigram at me, saying we were in among the icebergs. Something was said about speed, and he said that the ship had not been going fast yet, that they were to start up extra boilers that afternoon or evening. The telegram also spoke of the Deutschland, a ship out of coal, and asking for a tow, and when I asked him what they were going to do about it, he said they had no time for such matters, our ship wanted to do her best, and something was said about getting in Tuesday night. The strong impression, which was left in my mind, was that they were speeding the ship up to get away from the ice, and that we would probably get in late Tuesday night or early Wednesday morning. Mr. Ismay's manner was that of one in authority and the owner of the ship, and what he said was law. At the end of the day, the fact remains that Ismay was never in any position to direct the ship's speed or navigation, and Captain Smith knew this as well. Whether or not he gave anyone the impression that he had this authority, he was still travelling as a regular passenger and had no say in how the ship was meant to be handled. Mersey extended a kindness to Ismay, and put it on record that had Ismay not hopped into a lifeboat at the end, then his death would only have added to the tragic loss of life. But an indignant public was outraged that the company chairman had sought escape when 1,500 or so of his customers remained behind. Ismay's reputation was forever sullied by the allegations, and for the rest of his life, he almost never spoke again of Titanic or her sinking, even to his closest friends and family. Of course, one of the most important topics addressed during the inquiry was the fact Titanic had gone to sea equipped with far too lifeboats to accommodate all the passengers on board. This, it was quickly found, was thanks to outdated Board of Trade standards for lifeboat accommodations that were based on gross tonnage of ships, that is, their sheer size, rather than the number of people actually on board. In point of fact, Titanic really sailed with 6 more lifeboats than what was even really required, according to the Board of Trade standards. Now, here is where the Board of Trade could be actually called to account. The lifeboat standards were hopelessly outdated, but perhaps not without reason. The board was advised, in part, by owners and senior leadership of the big shipping companies, who might have balked at the idea of festooning their modern steamships with dozens and dozens of lifeboats. Of course, Mersey, who had British shipping and its reputation very much in mind, wasn't particularly interested in finding the Board of Trade at fault. While questioning Sir Walter J. Howell, Marine Director of the British Board of Trade, no small amount of confusion was stirred up while trying to understand the archaic protocols around lifeboats. But this brief snippet of conversation between the Attorney General and Mersey showed that this mentality was still alive and well even in the wake of Titanic. The Attorney General asked, "I've already indicated to your lordship that the argument which I shall use will be that it is much more important to make your ship as near as unsinkable as you can than to provide boats." The Commissioner said, "Of course it is." Despite this, it was blatantly obvious to everyone in the room that the lifeboat standards put forth by the Board of Trade almost 20 years ago were in desperate need of an update. But to what extent was the question? The last amendment to the protocols was back in 1894, when the 13,000-ton Cunarder's Lucania and Campania were the largest ships at sea. But now, 1912, ships were exploding in size up to nearly 50,000 gross registered tons. There was no denying that the standards were costing lives. During the course of Howell's questioning, a letter he wrote to the Secretary of the Merchant Shipping Advisory Committee of the Board of Trade, just 5 days after the Titanic disaster, was read aloud, and its contents, well, they were very telling. It said this: "The committee fully recognised that the proved impossibility of keeping such a vessel as the Titanic afloat after a collision with the ice until the arrival of outside succour has created an entirely new situation, which was neither in the contemplation of the Board of Trade nor of the committee, in the consideration of the extension of the existing boat scale in regards to vessels of 10,000 tons and upwards." It seemed that as ships grew in size, so did the apparent belief that they were also becoming more and more unsinkable, to the point that it seemed almost silly to equip them with any more lifeboats than what was found on ships 5 times smaller and almost 20 years older. It seems like excuse-making, and hindsight is, as they say, 2020. But how could some of the greatest minds in shipping not have foreseen a scenario just like this? Some did. Designers like Axel Wellen, who engineered the davits specifically to take on 2 rows of boats. Then there was even Titanic's own designers, especially the likes of Alexander Carlisle. Mersey grilled him about the number of boats Titanic carried and uncovered a shocking revelation. Mersey asked, "Did you think there ought to be 64? And Carlisle, "I thought there ought to be 3 on each set of davits." "How many would that make altogether?" Mersey asked. 48 boats, Carlisle said. Mersey asked, "You thought there ought to be 48? Carlisle simply said, "Yes." Far from being some kind of inconceivable issue, it seems the engineers and designers were, in fact, planning for the worst. It's just that, at the time, 48 boats on a liner of that size might have really seemed excessive. That, and the boats added a huge amount of cost, weight, and clutter. The loss of Titanic was a very violent wake-up call for the shipping world, and unless changes were made quickly, it should have seemed clear that a similar disaster would be unavoidable. But even then, several witnesses still stood firm on the belief that equipping a ship with enough lifeboats for all passengers would lead to the decks becoming cluttered, making it difficult for the crew to even ready them. Lord Mersey himself, after hearing several weeks' worth of testimony by this point, still remained sceptical at the idea of increasing lifeboat capacity for vessels to accommodate everyone on board. He said, I have at present serious doubts whether it should be a wise thing to direct lifeboat accommodation for every soul on board. I have serious doubts about it. It never has been done. It's quite true that the loss of the Titanic appears to point to the probability of it being wise to increase the lifeboat accommodation. Now, this back and forth around the lifeboats continued through much of the latter half of the proceedings, and a number of Board of Trade surveyors and officials were called up to give opinions and guidance. Everyone seemed to agree that more lifeboats were the obvious recommendation, but most of them actually stopped short of recommending lifeboats for everybody on board. On July 3rd, 1912, the final report of the Wreck Commissioner's inquiry into the loss of Titanic was handed down. It included the answers to the 26 questions put to the court on day 1 of the hearings, concerning everything from the ship's construction to the events of the voyage up until the disaster, to the treatment of ice warnings, the precautions taken when approaching the ice field, and ultimately the events surrounding the tragedy when the ship took her final plunge. Among the answers to those 26 questions, it was found that Titanic's speed, around 22 knots, approaching the ice field, was in fact excessive, given the warnings that had been received. At least 8 lifeboats were lowered with space on board for more passengers, and that the nearby ship Californian failed to render aid when Titanic was visible from their position and firing distress signals. In one section of the final report, the board concluded that, quote, "The disproportion between the numbers of the passengers saved in the first, second, and third classes is due to various causes, among which the difference in the position of their quarters and the fact that many of the third-class passengers were foreigners are perhaps the most important. And yet, just a few lines down, when asking the question, was the construction of the vessel and its arrangements such as to make it difficult for any class of passenger or any portion of the crew to take full advantage of any of the existing provisions for safety, the report simply answered, no, totally ignoring the fact that the third-class passengers were berthed far away and below the boats in endless twisting corridors that all looked the same with no direct access to the boat deck at all. In many cases, nobody came to help them or tell them where to go. No third-class passengers were even asked to give their testimony at the British Inquiry, even though more than 500 of their number had died on the night. An outrageous omission that by itself, in my opinion, casts a massive shadow of doubt over the entire proceedings. The report and the inquiry itself had been thorough, frustratingly so at times, and yet while it seemed to take pains to get to the bottom of some of the most intricate details, it merely glossed entirely over other big issues. Conflicting evidence from firemen and stokers that painted very different pictures of the amount of water actually flowing into the boiler rooms. Then there was the obvious difference in positions given out of Titanic's final resting place. The fact that many saw the ship break apart in her final moments. None of it was given much credence at all. A cynical mind might suggest that Mersey was trying his best to paint the situation with as positive a light as possible. Yet it had been a tragedy, that was certain. But it was a story of outdated regulations and mere oversight, absolutely not an indictment on British shipbuilding itself. The question of why Titanic's watertight bulkheads only rose slightly above the waterline and not all the way up the hull as they had on the great ship Great Eastern over half a century earlier wasn't really considered either. Still, like in the American hearings, there came a set of recommendations for much-needed updates to the board's protocols. It was suggested that changes be made to the height of the watertight bulkheads, and it was also recommended that more care should be taken with regard to those consistent boat drills, and that the drills should be manned appropriately by members of the crew, that ships should follow more careful navigational steps when encountering ice, and that 24/7 wireless communication should be made available on all ships while at sea. Now, none of that is much of a surprise. The most major consideration seemed to be with regard to the lifeboats. It had been that hot-button issue during the testimony phase of the hearings, and while many witnesses who were questioned, and Lord Mersey himself initially stood firm in the belief that having ample lifeboats for all passengers was unnecessary, even in the wake of the disaster, the final report relented and included recommendations that the accommodation should be sufficient for all persons on board, with, however, the qualification that in special cases where, in the opinion of the Board of Trade, such provision is impracticable, the requirements may be modified as the board may think right. So, Mersey and the others got their little caveat in, That and the provision of lifeboat and raft accommodation on board such ships should be based on the number of persons intended to be carried in the ship, and not upon tonnage. This seems frustratingly obvious today. A 20,000-ton tanker with 20 people on board doesn't need as many lifeboats as a 20,000-ton liner with 1,500, but as we've seen, change didn't tend to come easily at this point in history. Then there came the matter of the Californian. Remember that over the course of both the American and British inquiries, Captain Lord had maintained that the vessel he spotted nearby was too small to be Titanic, that he had no reason to believe the ship he saw was in any danger, assuming the flares simply to be company signals of some kind. But the report disagreed. It said, the Titanic collided with the berg at 11:40, the vessel seen by the Californian stopped at this time, the rockets sent up from the Titanic were distress signals, the Californian saw distress signals, the number sent up by the Titanic was about 8, the Californian saw 8, the time over which the rockets from the Titanic were sent up was from about 12:45 to 1:45 o'clock. It was about this time that the Californian saw the rockets. At 2:40, Mr. Stone called to the master that the ship from which he had seen the rockets had disappeared. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic had foundered. It was suggested that the rockets seen by the Californian were from some other ship, not the Titanic, but no other ship to fit this theory has ever been heard of. And to Lord's argument that they could not have rendered aid to Titanic thanks to the ship's comparatively slow speed and the presence of nearby ice, the report gave the following rebuttal. When she first saw the rockets, it said, the Californian could have pushed through the ice to open water without any serious risk and so to have come to the assistance of the Titanic. Had she done so, she might have saved many, if not all, of the lives that were lost. That was a damning final note, and probably a deeply unfair one. To suggest that Californian could definitely have pushed through ice to the open water is an incredible leap in logic, and well into the hypothetical. A very important note was made around Captain Smith's failing to slow the Titanic down as it approached the ice field, despite having received multiple ice warnings throughout the day. Now, this was a point of debate throughout the duration of questioning, as others with decades' experience as masters and officers, like Captain Ranson of the Baltic, agreed with Smith's decision to maintain speed despite the danger of ice. But the Wreck Commissioner's view was rightfully at odds with the practice, and the final report stated that the question is, what ought the master to have done? Why then did the master persevere in his course and maintain his speed? The answer is to be found in the evidence. It was shown that for many years past, indeed for a quarter of a century or more, the practice of liners using this track when in the vicinity of ice at night had been in clear weather to keep the course, to maintain the speed, and to trust to a sharp lookout to enable them to avoid the danger. This practice, it was said, had been justified by experience. I accept the evidence as to the practice and as to the immunity from casualties which is said to have been accompanied by it, but the event has proved the practice to be bad. Its root is probably to be found in competition and in the desire of the public for quick passages rather than in the judgment of navigators. In these circumstances, I am not able to blame Captain Smith. He was doing only that which other skilled men would have done in the same position. The evidence shows that he was not trying to make any record passage, or indeed any exceptionally quick passage. He was not trying to please anybody, but was exercising his own discretion in the way he thought best. He made a mistake, a very grievous mistake, but one in which, in face of the practice and of past experience, negligence cannot be said to have had any part. And in the absence of negligence, it is, in my opinion, impossible to fix Captain Smith with blame. It is, however, to be hoped that the last has been heard of the practice and that for the future it will be abandoned for what we know now to be more prudent and wiser measures. What was a mistake in the case of the Titanic would, without doubt, be negligence in any similar case in the future. Now, this is an incredible statement. Never mind that Smith had failed to post additional lookouts forward to assist in the spotting of ice, something that Captain Rostron on Carpathia did that very same night. Never mind that Smith had final say over the course, speed, and operation of his ship. Titanic had met its demise under Smith's command, and yet the captain was found entirely free of blame. In a similar maritime court over a decade earlier, a Captain Watkins of the SS Paris made a slight mathematical error and ran his ship onto the rocks off Cornwall. The inquiry found that his error alone constituted negligence, and despite his many years at sea, his career was over. Meanwhile, in the case of Captain Smith, a kind of distinction was drawn between simple mistakes and negligence that Watkins was never afforded. The difference was that Watkins had been captaining a liner over a decade old that had actually survived the event, while Titanic, the newest and finest ship afloat, had cast a pall over the entire British shipbuilding industry and merchant marine with its sinking. To suggest that Captain Smith was to blame would cast scrutiny over every British captain and their employers to boot. Better to suggest that Smith had made a mistake, but was also somehow not to be blamed. Now, just how those two conclusions managed to coexist peacefully in the mind of the Board of Inquiry is a mystery. The inquiry suggests blasting through known ice was just the done thing, even though Californian and other ships had decided to stop for the night instead. Of course, the hearing stopped short of placing any blame on the Board of Trade and the White Star Line. With the good name of British shipping on the line, this was a predictable outcome. In the view of the Board of Trade, directly implicating themselves or the White Star Line would result in massive reputational damage that would have devastating consequences for the entire British merchant marine at a time when Atlantic dominance was threatened weekly by emerging German and French competitors. That ships like Titanic could go to sea with more than 2,000 people aboard and no evacuation plan, no real thought given to what might have happened in the worst case scenario, is almost inexcusable. For representatives of the Board of Trade to grill the likes of Charles Lightoller over their handling of the evacuation is insulting because it was the board's own pathetic, plodding governance of safety at sea that had ensured Titanic's officers were completely unprepared on the night. This was in direct contrast to the American inquiry, which suffered from a lack of technical expertise, but was free from most of the conflicting interest of its British counterpart. It didn't hesitate to call a spade when it came to the negligence of Titanic's captain and the outdated standards and expectations that ultimately led to the loss of the ship and nearly 1,500 lives. In his memoir, Charles Lightoller put it succinctly when he wrote, "A washing of dirty linen would help no one. The Board of Trade had passed that ship as in all respects fit for the sea. Now the Board of Trade was holding an inquiry into the loss of that ship, hence the whitewash brush." With the Wreck Commissioner's inquiry finally concluded in the summer of 1912, White Star's headaches were still far from over. The company now needed to contend with the slew of lawsuits in the months following the disaster, with hundreds of claims quickly piled up, totaling over $16 million in damages, an absolute fortune today. It was clear the White Star Line wasn't out of the woods yet. That was a staggering amount of money, and the company was keen to reduce the financial stress they were under, while still reeling from the loss of their newest and potentially most profitable ship. This would lead to a whole new set of proceedings in New York the following year, where White Star appealed to considerably reduce the amount of losses the company was responsible for. The limitation of liability hearings, as they were known, were later settled in White Star Line's favour, and ultimately the company was found to be liable for just $664,000 worth of damages as a result of the disaster. Titanic's story is one of many tragedies. 1,496 individual tragedies for every one of the victims who lost their lives, hundreds more for those that survived but carried the emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Titanic existed in an incredible, bizarre, heady place and time when companies raced to outdo one another at breakneck pace with the newest, latest technology, when the operators, the captains, and the crews were under such pressure to maintain that regular schedule, they sped happily through fields of towering ice. But underlying all of it was a more insidious race, the rapid build-up of arms between Britain and Germany, the building of massive warships that harnessed technologies that had been perfected on ocean liners. To admit liability on the world stage would be a national shame, an international embarrassment. Lord Mersey would go on to oversee more maritime inquiries, including those into the losses of the Empress of Ireland, and perhaps most contentiously, the Lusitania. Each time, he seemed intent on clearing the operators and, most importantly of all, the government of blame. The inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic did have some lasting, meaningful impacts. It changed the way ships were built for the better. and mandated the use of lifeboats for all, but it failed to hold those truly to blame to account. To do so, they would have had to have looked in a mirror.